The heavy glass doors of the downtown bank swung open with a whisper, and Marcus stepped inside. The air-conditioned chill hit him like a wall, a stark contrast to the sweltering afternoon heat outside. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, brushing off the beads of sweat that clung to his neck. The bank was pristine, marble floors gleaming under the fluorescent lights, modern furniture arranged with precision, and the faint hum of hushed conversations filling the space. It was the kind of place that screamed wealth and exclusivity. Marcus had been here before, but today, something felt different. He approached the counter with a polite smile, clutching a neatly organized folder containing the documents for his transaction. The teller, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and an air of detached professionalism, barely glanced at him. "Good afternoon," Marcus began, his voice steady but warm. "I'm here to finalize some paperwork for my account." The teller's eyes flicked to him briefly before returning to her computer screen. "Name?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Marcus Thompson," he replied, sliding the folder across the counter. She took it without a word, her manicured fingers flipping through the papers. After a moment, she frowned. "You'll need to wait. Someone from management will assist you." Marcus nodded, though he couldn't help but notice the lack of explanation. "Do you know how long it might take?" She didn't look up. "Shouldn't be too long. Please take a seat." Marcus turned toward the waiting area, a cluster of sleek, uncomfortable chairs arranged near the large windows. He chose a seat in the corner, away from the other patrons. The room was sparsely populated, a middle-aged woman scrolling through her phone, a young couple whispering to each other, and an older man reading a newspaper. He settled in, glancing at the clock on the wall. 1:15 p.m. At first, he didn't mind the wait. Banks could be busy, and he understood that not everything could be handled immediately. But as the minutes ticked by, a subtle unease began to creep in. Other customers came and went, their transactions handled swiftly and with a smile. A man in a tailored suit walked in, was greeted warmly by a staff member, and escorted to a private office within moments. A woman in a designer dress approached the counter and was helped almost instantly. Marcus shifted in his seat, his eyes darting back to the clock. 1:45 p.m. 30 minutes had passed, and no one had approached him. He stood, smoothing the front of his shirt, and walked back to the counter. The same teller was there, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me," Marcus said, keeping his tone polite despite the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I've been waiting for a while now. Is there someone available to assist me?" She barely glanced at him. "I told you. Someone from management will handle it. Please return to the waiting area." Before Marcus could respond, she turned her attention to the next customer, a young white man in a polo shirt. Her demeanor shifted instantly, her smile was bright, her tone cheerful. Marcus clenched his jaw but said nothing. He returned to his seat, his mind racing. Was it just a busy day? Or was there something more to this? By 2 p.m., the unease had turned into irritation. He watched as customer after customer was served, some arriving long after he did. The staff seemed to avoid his gaze, their movements hurried whenever they passed near him. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails to pass the time. But the gnawing feeling in his gut wouldn't let him focus. He glanced around the room, catching the eye of the older man with the newspaper. The man gave him a brief nod, a flicker of sympathy in his expression, before returning to his reading. At 2:30 p.m., over an hour since he had arrived, Marcus stood again. This time, his frustration was evident in the set of his shoulders and the tightness of his voice. He approached a different teller, a young man with nervous eyes. "Excuse me. I've been waiting for over an hour now. Can you tell me what's going on?" The teller hesitated, glancing toward the back offices. I'm not sure, sir. Let me check with someone." He disappeared into a hallway, leaving Marcus standing at the counter. Minutes passed before the teller returned, his expression apologetic but vague. "Someone will be with you shortly," he said, his voice low. Marcus stared at him for a moment, searching for any hint of sincerity, but found none. With a sigh, he returned to his seat. By now, The waiting area was nearly empty. The middle-aged woman had left, as had the young couple. Only Marcus and the older man remained. The clock read 3 p.m. Marcus's patience was wearing thin. He had been polite, understanding, and patient, but it was clear that something wasn't right. He thought about leaving, but the principle of the matter kept him rooted to his seat. Why should he have to leave when he had done nothing wrong? As he sat there, his mind wandered to other experiences, subtle slights and microaggressions he had endured over the years. The times he had been followed in stores, the suspicious glances in upscale restaurants, the assumptions about his intelligence or income. He had learned to brush them off, to keep his head high and his dignity intact. But today, the weight of it all felt heavier than usual. At 3:15 p.m., the older man with the newspaper stood and approached Marcus. "You've been waiting a long time," the man said, his voice low and kind. Marcus nodded. "Yeah. Feels like they've forgotten about me." The man frowned. "Doesn't seem right. I've been watching, you've been here longer than anyone else." Marcus forced a smile. "Thanks for noticing." The man gave him a small nod before leaving the bank, his newspaper tucked under his arm. Now alone in the waiting area, Marcus felt the weight of every passing second. He glanced at the clock again. 3:30 p.m. 2 hours and 15 minutes since he had arrived. Just as he was about to stand and demand answers, the atmosphere in the bank shifted. The sound of a car pulling up outside drew his attention. Through the glass doors, he saw a sleek black sedan park at the curb. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, his presence commanding and authoritative. The CEO had arrived. The sleek black sedan gleamed under the afternoon sun, its arrival as precise and deliberate as the man who stepped out of it. Marcus watched through the glass doors as the CEO adjusted his cufflinks, his tailored suit fitting him like a second skin. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority that turned heads even before he entered the bank. Inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The staff, who had been moving at a leisurely pace moments ago, suddenly snapped into action. Tellers straightened their posture, the branch manager appeared from a side office, and hushed whispers rippled through the room. Marcus sat in the corner, unnoticed as always, but his curiosity was piqued. This man, whoever he was, clearly commanded respect. The CEO strode through the lobby with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He greeted no one, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if assessing every detail. When his gaze landed on Marcus, it lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Marcus felt a flicker of something, hope, perhaps? Recognition? He wasn't sure. But the CEO's expression was unreadable, and he quickly turned his attention to the branch manager, who was now hovering nervously nearby. "Mr. Calloway," the manager began, his voice tinged with both respect and anxiety. "We weren't expecting you today." "Clearly," the CEO replied, his tone cool and clipped. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. How are things running here?" The manager hesitated, glancing around the room as if searching for the right words. "Smoothly, sir. Very smoothly." The CEO raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp enough to cut through the manager's facade. "Is that so?" Marcus shifted in his seat, his frustration bubbling to the surface once again. He had been patient, more patient than anyone should have to be, but this charade of professionalism was too much. He stood, his movements deliberate but firm, and approached the counter. The staff froze, their eyes darting between Marcus and the CEO. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with irritation. "I've been waiting here for over 2 hours. Can someone please explain to me why I haven't been helped?" The room fell silent. The branch manager's face turned a shade paler, and the tellers exchanged nervous glances. The CEO turned to face Marcus fully, his expression unreadable. 2 hours, he repeated, his voice calm but with an edge that suggested he was not pleased. "Yes," Marcus replied, meeting the man's gaze. "I was told someone from management would assist me, but so far, no one has even acknowledged me. Meanwhile, I've watched other customers come and go. Most of them served within minutes." The CEO's eyes narrowed slightly, and he turned to the branch manager. "Is this true?" The manager stammered, his composure crumbling under the weight of the CEO's scrutiny. "Well, there must have been some sort of mix-up. I'll look into it right away." "Do that," the CEO said sharply. "But first, I'd like to know why this gentleman has been ignored for 2 hours while other customers were served promptly." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. Marcus crossed his arms, his frustration giving way to a quiet determination. He had been dismissed and overlooked for too long, and now, finally, someone was paying attention. The CEO turned back to Marcus, his expression softening slightly. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus supplied. "Mr. Thompson," the CEO said, his tone measured. "I sincerely apologize for the way you've been treated today. This is not how we conduct business, and I assure you, this matter will be addressed immediately." Marcus nodded, appreciating the man's words but still wary. Apologies were easy, action was harder. The CEO gestured toward one of the private offices. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to personally assist you with your transaction." Marcus hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Thank you." As they walked toward the office, Marcus couldn't help but notice the staff's reactions. Some looked guilty, others embarrassed, but none of them met his eyes. Inside the office, the CEO closed the door and gestured for Marcus to take a seat. The room was luxurious, with leather chairs and a polished oak desk. "Now," the CEO began, sitting across from Marcus, "let's take care of your business first. Then we'll address what happened out there." Marcus explained his transaction, his voice steady despite the lingering frustration. The CEO listened intently, his demeanor professional but with an undercurrent of genuine concern. Within minutes, the matter was resolved, something that could have been done hours ago if not for the blatant disregard he had experienced. When the transaction was complete, the CEO leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "I'd like to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead. Do you believe the way you were treated today was due to your race?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I can't say for certain," he began, "but I've lived long enough to recognize patterns. The way I was ignored, the way other customers were prioritized, it felt deliberate. And unfortunately, it's not the first time I've experienced something like this." The CEO nodded slowly, his expression grave. "I appreciate your honesty. And I want you to know that this is not something I take lightly." He stood, his movements deliberate, and extended a hand to Marcus. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I promise you, changes will be made." Marcus shook his hand, feeling a flicker of hope. "I hope so. Because no one should have to go through what I did today." As Marcus left the office, the staff avoided his gaze, their discomfort palpable. The CEO, however, stood in the center of the lobby, his presence commanding. "Everyone," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "I need to speak with you all immediately. Close the doors and put up the temporarily closed sign. This is a conversation that cannot wait." Marcus didn't stay to hear what was said. As he stepped out into the afternoon sun, he felt a mix of emotions: relief, frustration, and a lingering anger that refused to fade. But beneath it all, there was a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger. The next morning, Marcus woke up still carrying the weight of yesterday's events. He had hoped that a good night's sleep would ease the frustration. But the memory of those long hours spent waiting in the bank lingered like an unwelcome guest. The polished apology from the CEO had been appreciated, but Marcus was no stranger to empty promises. Words were easy, change was harder. He poured himself a cup of coffee and opened his phone, scrolling through the morning news. To his surprise, a headline caught his eye. "Local bank faces allegations of racial discrimination after incident goes viral." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He clicked on the article, his eyes scanning the text. Someone at the bank, perhaps a customer or even one of the staff, had recorded parts of the incident and shared it online. The video showed Marcus sitting in the waiting area, the tellers avoiding him, and the stark contrast in how other customers were treated. The post had gained traction overnight, with thousands of comments and shares. The article quoted several viewers who expressed outrage at the blatant discrimination. Some shared their own stories of being treated unfairly in similar situations, while others called for boycotts and protests against the bank. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the coffee forgotten in his hand. He hadn't asked for this attention, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing the issue brought to light. For too long, people like him had been ignored, their experiences dismissed as overreactions or misunderstandings. Now, the world was watching. At the bank, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The video had reached the CEO's desk before dawn, and he had already called an emergency meeting with the senior leadership team. "This is a disaster," one executive said, pacing the room. "We're trending on every social media platform. And the comments are brutal. People are calling us a racist institution." The CEO, Mr. Calloway, sat at the head of the table, his expression grim. He had spent the night replaying the events in his mind, trying to understand how such blatant discrimination could have occurred under his watch. He prided himself on running a modern, inclusive company, but yesterday's incident had exposed a rot beneath the surface. "This isn't just a PR problem," Calloway said, his voice calm but firm. "This is a systemic issue. That man, Mr. Thompson, was ignored for over 2 hours while other customers were served immediately. I want to know why." The branch manager, who had been summoned to the meeting, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It was a misunderstanding," he began, but Calloway cut him off with a sharp look. "Don't insult my intelligence," Calloway said coldly. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was discrimination. Whether it was conscious or unconscious, it happened, and now we're all going to answer for it." The room fell silent. Calloway continued, his tone steely. "I've already hired an external firm to conduct a full investigation. Every employee at that branch will be interviewed, and we'll be reviewing all customer interactions over the past year. If there's a pattern of bias, we'll find it." "But the public backlash," another executive began, but Calloway raised a hand to silence him. "The public backlash is justified," he said. "We failed. And now we have to own up to it. I'll be issuing a public statement this afternoon, and I want a detailed action plan on my desk by the end of the day. This isn't just about saving face, it's about doing what's right." Meanwhile, Marcus's phone buzzed with messages and calls. Friends, family, and even strangers had seen the video and reached out to offer their support. Some encouraged him to take legal action against the bank, while others simply wanted to share their own experiences of discrimination. One message stood out, a direct email from Mr. Calloway himself. Subject: a personal apology and an invitation. "Dear Mr. Thompson, I want to once again extend my deepest apologies for the way you were treated at our branch yesterday. After reflecting on the incident, I realize that an apology alone is not enough. I would like to invite you to meet with me and our leadership team to discuss how we can address this issue, not just within our bank but in the broader community. Your voice and perspective are invaluable, and I believe we can learn a great deal from your experience. Please let me know if you would be willing to meet. I understand if you need time to consider this, but I hope you'll give us the opportunity to make things right. Sincerely, David Calloway, CEO, bank name." Marcus read the email twice, unsure of how to feel. On one hand, he appreciated the gesture. It was rare for someone in Calloway's position to take such direct responsibility. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more about damage control than genuine change. After a moment's thought, he replied. Subject: a personal apology and an invitation. Dear Mr. Calloway, thank you for your email. I appreciate your apology and your willingness to address this issue. I would be open to meeting with you and your team, but I want to make one thing clear. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what I did. If we're going to have this conversation, I want it to lead to real, tangible change. I'm not interested in empty promises or PR stunts. Let me know when and where we can meet. Sincerely, Marcus Thompson. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, but in the meantime, the bank remained under intense scrutiny. News outlets picked up the story, and protests were organized outside the branch. Signs reading "End Discrimination and Equal Treatment for All" lined the sidewalks, and chants echoed through the streets. Inside the bank, the staff was on edge. The investigation was already underway, and employees were being interviewed one by one. Some admitted to feeling pressure to prioritize certain customers over others, while others denied any wrongdoing. The external investigators uncovered troubling patterns. Black customers were often subjected to longer wait times, less personalized service, and more scrutiny during transactions. While some employees claimed ignorance, others admitted that these biases were an unspoken but pervasive part of the workplace culture. When the findings were presented to Calloway, he felt a surge of anger and shame. The bank he had worked so hard to build had failed its customers, and the responsibility ultimately rested with him. By the time Marcus arrived for the meeting, the bank was already in the process of implementing changes. Calloway greeted him personally, his demeanor respectful but serious. "Mr. Thompson," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." Marcus shook his hand, his expression guarded. "Let's hope this meeting is worth my time." They sat in a conference room with several members of the leadership team, as well as representatives from the external investigation firm. Calloway began by presenting the findings of the investigation, sparing no detail. "We failed you," he said plainly. "And we've failed others like you. There's no excuse for what happened. But I want you to know that we're taking immediate action." He outlined the steps the bank was taking: mandatory bias training for all employees, a complete overhaul of customer service protocols, and the creation of a diversity and inclusion task force. Marcus listened carefully, his arms crossed. When Calloway finished, he leaned forward. "This is a start," Marcus said. "But it's just that, a start. Policies and training are important, but culture doesn't change overnight. You need to hold your employees accountable, and you need to listen to your customers. If you're serious about this, you'll follow through." Calloway nodded. "I couldn't agree more. And I'd like to ask for your help in holding us accountable. Would you consider joining our task force as an advisor?" Marcus was taken aback. He hadn't expected this. After a moment's thought, he nodded slowly. "If it means making a difference, then yes. I'll do it." The room erupted into applause, but Marcus raised a hand to silence them. "This isn't a victory," he said firmly. "Not yet. The real work starts now." The days following the meeting were a whirlwind for Marcus. His decision to join the bank's diversity and inclusion task force had thrust him into a position of unexpected influence. And his story continued to spread far beyond the walls of the bank. What had started as a moment of quiet frustration in a waiting area was now a flashpoint for a larger conversation about systemic discrimination, not just in banking but in everyday life. The protests outside the bank grew larger, their chants louder, as people from all walks of life joined the movement. Local activists, civil rights organizations, and even prominent community leaders rallied behind Marcus's story, using it as a rallying cry for change. Signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "Equality" now lined the streets, and news cameras captured every moment. Marcus, however, remained cautious. While he appreciated the support, he knew how easily movements like this could lose focus. He didn't want this to become just another viral moment that faded into obscurity once the outrage died down. He wanted real, lasting change, and that meant staying involved. Even when the cameras stopped rolling. Inside the bank, the ripple effects of Marcus's story were impossible to ignore. The investigation had concluded, and the findings were damning. Not only had there been clear evidence of racial bias in how customers were treated, but the culture of the branch had enabled and perpetuated that bias. Several employees, including the branch manager, were terminated as a result. For the remaining staff, the changes were immediate and unrelenting. Mandatory bias training sessions were held weekly, and employees were required to participate in open discussions about race, privilege, and the impact of unconscious bias. Some embraced the changes, eager to learn and grow, while others resisted. Their discomfort evident in every session. The CEO, David Calloway, made it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. "This is not optional," he told his employees during a company-wide meeting. "If you're not willing to do the work to create an inclusive environment, then this is not the place for you." Meanwhile, Marcus's role on the task force quickly expanded. At first, he had been hesitant to accept the position, unsure if his voice would truly be heard. But as the meetings progressed, he found himself becoming more and more involved. The task force was composed of employees from various levels of the bank, as well as external advisors with expertise in diversity and inclusion. Together, they worked to identify the root causes of the bank's problems and develop strategies to address them. For Marcus, the work was both challenging and deeply personal. He shared his experiences not just from the bank but from his life and encouraged others to do the same. At times, the conversations were uncomfortable, especially when employees confronted their own biases. But Marcus knew that discomfort was necessary for growth. One particular meeting stood out. A young teller, visibly nervous, raised her hand to speak. "I just want to say, I didn't realize how much I've contributed to this problem," she admitted. "I've always thought of myself as a good person. But after hearing Marcus's story and reflecting on my own actions, I see how I've been complicit. I've judged people based on their appearance. I've made assumptions. And I'm sorry." Her voice cracked, and Marcus felt a pang of empathy. He nodded, his tone gentle but firm. "Acknowledging it is the first step," he said. "But the real work is in what you do next. It's not enough to feel sorry, you have to take action." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Outside the bank, the story continued to gain momentum. Marcus was invited to speak at community events, panel discussions, and even a televised town hall about racial inequality in corporate spaces. At first, he felt out of his depth. He wasn't an activist or a public speaker. He was just a man who had been fed up with being ignored. But as he stood before crowds of people, sharing his story and calling for change, he realized the power of his voice. He wasn't just speaking for himself, he was speaking for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or dehumanized because of the color of their skin. One evening, after a particularly emotional speech at a community center, an older woman approached him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears as she took his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling, "for standing up, for speaking out. I've lived a long time, and I've seen too many people stay silent. You give me hope." Marcus squeezed her hand, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means more than you know." Back at the bank, the changes were beginning to take root. The Diversity and Inclusion Task Force launched several initiatives, including a mentorship program for underrepresented employees, partnerships with community organizations, and a new system for tracking and addressing customer complaints. Marcus also pushed for transparency. "If we're serious about change," he told the task force, "then we need to hold ourselves accountable. That means sharing our progress and our failures with the public." The bank agreed, publishing regular reports on their efforts and inviting independent auditors to evaluate their progress. It was a bold move, and one that earned both praise and scrutiny. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus began to see the impact of his efforts. Customers of all backgrounds reported feeling more welcome and respected at the bank. Employees who had once been skeptical of the changes began to embrace them, recognizing the value of a more inclusive workplace. But Marcus knew the work was far from over. Change, he had learned, was not a destination but a journey, a constant process of learning, unlearning, and growing. One afternoon, as he walked past the bank on his way home, he noticed a new sign in the window. It read, "We're listening. We're learning. We're changing." Marcus stopped and stared at the sign, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was enough. Months had passed since the day Marcus Thompson had walked into the bank, expecting nothing more than a routine transaction. What had unfolded since then had changed not only his life but also the lives of countless others. The bank had undergone a transformation, both in policy and culture. And Marcus had become an unlikely symbol of resilience and change in his community. But for Marcus, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the accolades, it was in the quiet, everyday moments where he could see the impact of his efforts. One such moment came on a crisp autumn morning. Marcus had stopped by the same bank branch. Not as an advisor or a task force member this time, but simply as a customer. He hadn't been there in months, preferring to handle most of his banking online to avoid the memories of that frustrating afternoon. But today, he needed to deposit a check, and he wanted to see for himself how things had changed. As he stepped inside, the familiar hum of the bank greeted him. The marble floors still gleamed, the furniture still looked sleek and modern, but something was undeniably different. The atmosphere felt warmer, more welcoming. The tellers smiled at customers, greeting them by name when possible. A young man in a wheelchair was being assisted at the counter with genuine care and attentiveness. Marcus approached the counter, and a teller, one he didn't recognize, greeted him with a bright smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" Marcus handed her the check and ID. "Just a deposit, please." As she processed the transaction, Marcus noticed a small plaque on the counter. "We value every customer. Thank you for allowing us to serve you." He couldn't help but smile. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The teller handed him his receipt and added, "Thank you for banking with us, Mr. Thompson. Have a wonderful day." Marcus paused, surprised. "You know my name?" She nodded, her smile unwavering. "Of course. You're one of the reasons we've made so many changes here. I've read about your story, and I just want to say thank you. You've made a difference." Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion. He nodded, murmuring a quiet thank you before stepping away from the counter. As he walked out of the bank, he felt lighter than he had in months. The changes at the bank were just one part of a larger ripple effect. Other businesses in the city had begun examining their own practices, inspired by the bank's public commitment to accountability and inclusion. Community leaders organized workshops and forums to address systemic inequality, and Marcus was often invited to speak. At first, he had been hesitant to take on such a public role. He wasn't an activist or a politician, he was just a man who had been tired of being ignored. But as he stood before audiences, sharing his story and encouraging others to speak out, he realized the power of his voice. One evening, after a panel discussion at a local college, a young woman approached him. She was nervous, clutching a notebook to her chest, but her eyes were filled with determination. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "I just wanted to say thank you. Your story inspired me to speak up at my job. I work in retail, and I've seen so many customers treated unfairly because of how they look. I used to stay quiet because I was afraid of losing my job, but after hearing what you did, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. I reported it to my manager, and they're actually making changes." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's incredible," he said. "It takes courage to speak up, especially when it feels like no one's listening. But you did the right thing." She nodded, her confidence growing. I wanted you to know that what you're doing matters. It's making a difference." As she walked away, Marcus sat down on a nearby bench, letting her words sink in. He hadn't set out to become a symbol of change, but knowing that his actions had inspired others made every difficult moment worth it. Back at home, Marcus often reflected on how far things had come. The Diversity and Inclusion Task Force had continued its work, and while there were still challenges, the progress was undeniable. The bank had become a model for other institutions, and Marcus's role as an advisor had expanded to include consulting with other companies looking to address similar issues. But for Marcus, the most meaningful moments were the quiet ones, the conversations with strangers who shared their stories, the small changes he noticed in his community. and the knowledge that he had played a part in making things better. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from David Calloway, the bank's CEO. Subject: Thank you. Dear Marcus, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you again for everything you've done. Your courage and determination have not only changed our bank but have also inspired me personally. I've learned more from you in the past few months than I have in my entire career. And I'm committed to continuing this work not just as a CEO, but as a person. I hope you know how much of a difference you've made. Sincerely, David. Marcus read the message twice, a small smile playing on his lips. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, watching as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the frustration, the anger, the moments of doubt, and realized that while the fight for justice was far from over, he had found something he hadn't expected: peace. Sometimes, change didn't come with loud victories or grand gestures. Sometimes, it came quietly, in the form of a smile at a bank counter, a conversation with a stranger, or a simple message of gratitude. And for Marcus, that was enough.